What is the mission of the bar?
Thank you, Phil. Basically, the bar has three missions, three basic missions. The first of those, and the most important, is regulation of the legal profession in Virginia. In other words, the disciplinary system for dealing with attorneys who have problems with the rules of conduct. A second mission is to improve the legal system and the judicial system in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And then the third of our missions is to try to improve the availability of legal services to those in the Commonwealth who cannot afford legal services. So those would be the main missions of the State Bar.
Over the past years, what have been your primary responsibilities and duties as president of the bar?
Well, essentially, we have a number of executive committee meetings and bar council meetings, and the bar council is the governing body of the Virginia State Bar. It is composed of about 75 lawyers across the state, all the different geographical areas of the state. And those bar council members are essentially elected by attorneys in the state. And what we do on about 3 occasions each year is get together that bar council and decide and resolve policy issues relating to the activities of the State Bar. In the meantime, we occasionally have executive committee meetings, maybe half a dozen of those during the year, and it's my responsibility to chair the Bar Council meetings as well as the executive committee meetings. In addition, if issues relating to the bar come to public attention, I am often the person that is called by the news media and would respond on behalf of the bar.
Name some initiatives that the bar undertook while under your leadership over the past year.
We had an executive director who had been with us for 18 years, Tom Edmonds, and Tom was acknowledged in the nation as probably the best executive director of any state bar. He retired, and so we knew we were going to have to replace him, and we ended up carrying out a very successful search and hired a Virginia lawyer, in fact a lawyer who had been the immediate past president, in other words had my role at the State Bar, and this is Karen Gould from Richmond. She's a Richmond attorney, and in December she took over as executive director, and she's very committed to the bar. She's an excellent executive director and is doing a very nice job for us, and she's been on the job now for about 6 months. We also put into effect this year an increase in contributions to the Client Protection Fund. We have a fund that a year or so ago consisted of about $3 million that we use when people have assets taken by lawyers in a dishonest way. The Client Protection Fund is able to step in and sometimes give them compensation for their losses. And we had an actuarial study done some years ago that said instead of $3 million, that fund ought to be closer to $9 million. So we went through the legislature, had an assessment imposed by statute so that now lawyers pay $25 per year, and what that does is it enhances that Client Protection Fund by about $700,000 a year. So in another 6 or 8 years, we'll probably be at that actuarial target of close to $9 million. But it's got over $4 million in it now. We had some lingering issues that we are still dealing with and have not resolved. One of them that has received some attention is the question of mandatory malpractice insurance, whether in order to practice law in Virginia you must have malpractice insurance. That's not the case today. It's not the case in most states. And in fact, in Virginia, about 90% of the lawyers do have malpractice insurance. But we're looking at the question of whether we ought to require that in the state. Another thing that has gotten some attention this year and that we're trying to deal with is a question of whether attorney trust accounts should be audited on a random basis. We've had several instances in the last 2 or 3 years where attorneys have violated rules of conduct, they have violated the law, and they have ended up misappropriating millions of dollars of client money. And in some states, there is a program for random audit of attorney trust accounts. That's where the money, the client money, is held by attorneys. And we are now looking at the question of whether Virginia should adopt a program of random audits of attorney trust accounts.
What would you say was your biggest accomplishment as president of the bar? And in that same vein, what is it that you wanted to do but didn't get around to doing?
I think the biggest accomplishment is making the transition and getting our executive directorship in good hands. Coming off of a super well-respected executive director, and we now have in place another executive director that looks like she will be following in those same footsteps. In terms of things that I would like to have done, I would like to have in place random audits of trust accounts. That is something that 10 or 12 states have. We've had interviews with bar council members in some of those other states, and they talk about what an effective program it is, and how small a burden it is on the attorneys to do these random audits. And I'd like to see that happen.
Who would do the random audits?
North Carolina has had a random audit program for about 25 years, and they have one staff auditor. So he is an employee of the state bar, and he does about 240 audits a year. It's not a full-blown CPA audit. It takes 4 or 5 hours in the attorney's office. The auditor will call the law firm and say, I'm going to be there in about 10 days and would like to see your trust account records. And it can be handled very expeditiously, and it, again, is not a burden, not a real burden on the law firms. Love the practice of law. I've loved working with and being associated in particular with the people here in this law firm and in the city of Norfolk. It is a wonderful bar.